Hi, I'm Gareth Green, and in this video we're going to be thinking about how to resolve a dominant seventh chord. Okay, let's have just a quick think about what a dominant seventh is. So the dominant is the fifth note of the scale. So if we're in the key of C major, well, the fifth note is G, C, D, E, F, G, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If we make a chord on the fifth note, that will be the dominant chord. So a root, a third, and a fifth above the root, so that's G, B, D. That's the dominant chord. If I want to make it a dominant seventh, well, I add a seventh above it. So root, 3 above the root, 5 above the root, 7 above the root. So that's a dominant seventh. So in any key, you look for the fifth degree of the scale and you make that 1, 3, 5, 7 chord using any sharps or flats that are in the key signature, and you've got your dominant seventh chord. Well, if you're reading these kind of dominant seventh chords on a lead sheet, you'll see things like G7, for example. That's how that chord would be described. And if you're playing that on the keyboard or the guitar, you'll know what that chord is, and it's all very straightforward. You just play that. If you're writing and playing music that's using conventional four-part harmony, there are certain rules of engagement about how to resolve a dominant seventh. In other words, what follows the dominant seventh chord and how do we have to go about that? And that's really what I'm talking about here, because lots of people, when they write dominant sevenths in music, don't fully comprehend how they're supposed to resolve them, and then they often say there's something sounds slightly strange about what's going on here. So hopefully we can mop all this up in the next few minutes. And basically this is how it goes. If you have a dominant seventh chord, this is not true of other sevenths necessarily, so you can have a seventh on any chord. So if I'm in C major, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. They're the 7 notes before I get back to the first one again. I can have a seventh there, and because it's on the first note of the scale, it's a tonic seventh or a 1/7. Then I can have a supertonic seventh or a 2/7, a mediant seventh or a 3/7, a subdominant seventh or a 4/7. A dominant seventh or a 5/7, that's what we're talking about. Then you can have a submediant seventh, a 6/7. You can have a leading note seventh, a 7/7. So all these degrees of the scale, you can form sevenths on. But if you're forming it on the fifth degree of the scale, the dominant seventh, there are particular rules of engagement that are worth knowing about, because of all the seventh chords, we use the dominant seventh more than any other. So let's take that G7 chord, that dominant seventh chord in the key of C. So G, B, D, F. And there are a couple of rules of engagement that we're going to consider. And this is all about something we call voice leading. In other words, if there's a note that particularly wants to be followed by another note, then that's what voice leading is. So when you hear this chord, you hear this note at the top, and if you had to sing the next note, what would it be? You'd probably want to come down to this note, la, la. So you see the seventh wants to fall. That's voice leading. Also, the third of that chord, this B natural, B is the third and the B wants to rise. So the seventh wants to fall and the third wants to rise. So you fall by step, you rise by step, both by a semitone or a half step in this case. Now, there's often a rule that's stated in textbooks which I believe to be slightly incorrectly stated. And let me try and explain why. The rule is sometimes stated like this, that in order to resolve a dominant seventh chord, you must follow it with a chord 1, a tonic chord, or a chord 6, the submediant chord. Well, that's not really the rule. The rule is what I've just been talking about, that the seventh wants to fall and the third wants to rise. But the thing is, if the seventh falls and the third rises, you end up with 2 notes. in this case C and E. Now C and E are the root and the third of a chord 1 in the key of C, the tonic chord, or they're the third and the fifth of a chord 6 in C, the submedian chord. So that's why you end up following the dominant seventh with a tonic chord, a chord 1, or a chord 6, the submedian chord, not because you have to do that, but because if the seventh is going to fall by step and the third is going to rise by step, those are the only two chords that will fit. So I hope that gives you some of the kind of reasoning behind what's going on here. Now, of course, you can break those voice leading rules if you like. You know, it's up to you. If you think it sounds good, that's the ultimate acid test, isn't it? But those are the kind of rules of thumb that are worth thinking about. And normally, that's what wants to happen. So now we've got that straight, let's have a look at these examples that we've got in front of us and let me talk through some of the issues that come out of this. So just to make life a bit more interesting, I'm now going to talk about how to resolve a dominant seventh chord, and we're going to be in the key of D major. So D major's got F sharp and C sharp. So the chords are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And so the dominant seventh chord is the fifth note of the scale A, and then we're going to go 3, 5, 7, and I'm using C sharp because C sharp's in the scale of D major. Okay, so when you look at example 1, this first chord here is the 5-7 chord. Let's see how it's organised. I've got the root of the chord in the bass, I've got the third in the soprano part, then I've got the fifth in the tenor part, and the seventh in the alto part. So what are we saying? The seventh has got to fall. So here's the seventh, and that's going to fall by step. And the third's going to rise. Here's the third, it's going to rise by step. So you can hear that that top part, the third, is going up, and the alto part, that seventh, is coming down. You can hear those two parts together as well, can't you? They want to resolve in that particular way. You can sort of hear that. Okay, well, I'm filling in the other part. So example number 1 goes like this, which is fine because it obeys the rules, doesn't it? The seventh has fallen by a step, the third has risen by a step, and I've gone from a chord 5-7 here to a chord 1 there, obeying the rules. Now, there's only one little problem about this. It's not a massive problem, but if you look at how this then works out, you'll notice that I've got the tonic note 3 times. That D, the first note of the scale, I've got it in the bass, I've got it in the tenor, and I've got it in the soprano. So I've got what's called a triple root. Doesn't sound horrible, but it means there's no A in the chord. There's no fifth anywhere in that chord. Now, if you want to miss a note out of any chord, it's usually the fifth that you can choose to omit. So if you don't want to have a fifth in a chord, that's absolutely fine. So there's nothing wrong with example 1. Other than when you hear that chord 1, it just sounds a little bit kind of tonic focused, doesn't it? Doesn't sound bad in any way whatsoever. But one thing you might think about if you're writing this stuff and you end up with that triple root situation is, can we have the same situation, but if we organise the middle parts differently, does it work out better? So in example 2, you can see the soprano is still going C sharp D as example 1 did. The bass is still going A D as example 1 did. But I've reorganised the middle, so I've got 2 A's in the alto part. I've put the seventh in the tenor this time, which is falling by step to F sharp. Okay, well, what difference does that make? The difference it makes is that then we end up in that tonic chord with 2 roots, bottom and top. We've got a third in the tenor, we've got a fifth in the alto. So it makes for a slightly better final chord than this one. And how do we achieve it? Simply by reorganizing the inner parts a little bit. And you can also see that when I have the dominant seventh chord, I've got the root in the bass, I've got the third in the soprano, I haven't got the 5th anywhere, but I've got the 7th in the tenor, but you'll notice that the root is doubled. Doubling the root is often quite a strong thing to do. But you see what I've done? I've missed out the 5th of the dominant 7th chord in order to get a fuller tonic chord to finish. So it doesn't sound massively different, but sometimes just organising things in a slightly different way with the middle parts means you get a better final chord. So nothing wrong with example 1. Example 2 might be deemed to be marginally better. But it's a funny thing, isn't it? Because in example 1, we've got a complete 5/7 chord and an incomplete tonic chord. In example 2, we've got an incomplete 5/7 chord and a complete tonic chord. But on balance, example 2 works slightly better than example 1. Okay, well, what am I doing then in example 3? Well, I'm showing you how you might decorate things a little bit. And this is often what happens in reality. So here, I'm starting on this first chord with a chord 5, a dominant chord with no 7th in it. And then we have what looks like a passing note in the alto. It's moving by step from the note before and by step onto the note after. But this passing note happens to be the 7th of a dominant 7th chord, of the 5/7 chord. So we start with 5, then we have a passing note that makes it 5/7 on our way to 1. So that sounds quite good because you start with a 5, you make the 5 stronger by making it a 5/7, and then you go to 1. It's nearly always better to do it that way round. Start with an ordinary chord 5, dominant chord, make it stronger by adding the 7th, and then move on to the resolution, rather than starting with the dominant 7th and weakening it by taking the 7th away. You see the logic in that. So that's what's going on there. Now, of course, what we've got here is something that's a slight decoration over the previous examples, but we've ended up with the example 1 problem, haven't we, of the triple root. Have a look at example 4, because what I'm doing is that little trick we did when we compared example 1 with example 2, because this time I'm reorganizing the middle parts so that we can end up with a complete final chord. So you can see what I'm doing here. I'm starting with 5, I'm going to 5/7, then I'm going to 1, exactly what we did in example 3, but this time it's happening in the tenor part, so that the tenor part can give us the 7th resolving downwards, but the alto part can just repeat that A. Repeating the A is quite a nice thing to do as well, because it's what we call a common note. In other words, you have A in the dominant chord, chord 5, and you also have A in the tonic chord, chord 1. So if you have a common note, if you can repeat it in the same voice, that's a stronger thing to do. You can see that in the first version, we had A in the bass, but it had to move to D, didn't it? So we couldn't use the common note there. When we reorganized things in example 2, we were able to use that common note in the alto. We're not able to use the common note repetition in this example, in example 3, but we can in example 4. And by then putting this movement into the tenor part, we end up with a full chord 1. So example 4 goes and gives you that fuller finish. Okay, example 5 is just showing a way of elaborating it a step further. So it's exactly the same as example 4, but this time we're going to put in a passing note. So whenever you have this melodic interval of a third, you can always think, is there a chance to tuck in the note in between? So we've got E followed by G, F sharp comes between them. So how about we just stick in that F sharp as what we call a passing note or a passing tone, and it just elaborates it even further. So example 4 sounds like this. Example 5 sounds like this. And you can hear and see it's just a way of elaborating it a touch further. Okay, let's have a look at example 6 and see what I've done here. Well, in example 6, I'm just laying out the chord in a slightly different way, but we're doing exactly the same thing. So we're going 5, 7 to 1 in this first version of it. So that's exactly what we were doing in example 1, really, but we're just reorganizing the parts a bit. But you see, same problem. We've got this triple root as the conclusion. Okay, now then, this is the point at which I can tell you about one exception to this rule. Remember, the rule is the 7th has to fall by step, the 3rd has to rise by step. Okay, here's the exception. If by making the 3rd rise by step, you create a tonic chord with a triple root in it, then that 3rd of the dominant 7th chord is allowed to fall to the 5th of the tonic chord. All right, so this applies when you're following your chord 5, 7, your dominant 7th, with a chord 1. Okay, so the 7th has to fall by step, that's a given. But if the 3rd rises by step, and that's the thing that causes you to have a triple root in the next chord, then you are allowed to have that 3rd fall to the 5th of the next tonic chord. Okay, so looking at example 6, the first bar of this is showing you how to obey the rule. The 7th falls by step in the alto. The 3rd rises by step in the tenor. In the second bar, I'm rewriting that slightly. The 7th still falls by step in the alto because it must, but this 3rd, instead of rising by step in the tenor, which is what it's supposed to do, is falling to A, which is the 5th of the next chord. Now that's another good way to make sure we get a complete tonic chord. So the first version in 6, the first bar, triple root. The second bar of 6, the other way of doing this, just gives you a slightly fuller chord because we've now got the 5th in that chord in the tenor part. Okay, so I hope that makes sense, that little exception. Okay, well, when we go on to example 7, we're now just talking about other options for decorating. So what's going on here? Well, I start with chord 5. I'm going to use a passing note. We talked about that a few moments ago. The passing note is going to take me on to the 7th. So 5, passing, 5, 7. And then, instead of just going straight to chord 1, in the tenor part, I'm using a 4-3 suspension. Okay, so that's a 4-3 suspension. Why is it a 4-3 suspension? That G is a 4th above the bass D. I've got D in the bass, that G is a 4th above it. It's an octave and a 4th, but that doesn't matter. And it's going from the 4th above the bass to the 3rd above the bass, the F sharp. Okay, so that's a suspension. A suspension has to be prepared, it has to sound, it has to resolve. It's prepared here, it sounds here, it resolves there. Okay, so prepare and sound must be the same note as each other. Prepare must belong to its chord. Resolve must belong to its chord. And when you go from suspend to resolve, you have to go by step, normally downward. So this obeys all the rules of a suspension, and it's a 4-3 suspension. So we're doing just the same chords, you know, we're going 5, 7, 1, but this time we're adding in a passing note and a suspension. So the first bar of number 7 sounds like this. So you can hear that kind of, you know, zips it up a bit further, doesn't it? Rather than just going 5, 7, 1. And then all I'm showing you in the second bar of number 7 is how you could elaborate that even further. You've got the 4-3 suspension, but when you decorate a suspension, you can go 4-2-3. And that's just a way to decorate it a little bit. So the additional note is this, where we're just going to go 4-2-3. So the second bar of number 7 goes like this. So that's just a way of kind of putting more icing on the cake, if you like. Okay, we're getting there. Example number 8 is starting the same as example number 7. So you can see we've got 5 going to 5, 7 using the passing note. But this time we're going to do a cadential 6, 4, 5, 3. So in other words, instead of going straight to the resolution of the 7th onto the tonic, I can actually do this. Okay, so previously I was going straight to the chord 1, but using a 4-3 suspension in the tenor. Now I'm arriving on the chord 1, but by using B and G in the alto and the tenor parts there, I'm actually using chord 4, the subdominant chord, to delay the resolution to the 1. Okay, so this goes to this at the end. So let's just be clear about that. This is chord 4 in second inversion. So it's what we call 4C, 4 in second inversion. You might know that as a 4-6-4 chord, but it's the same thing. It's 4 in second inversion, and that goes on to chord 1. And this is called a 6-4-5-3 cadential progression. So it's a way of interrupting the resolution. This resolves onto this, but this is a way of just delaying it for a moment. So we have chord 5, passing note becomes 5-7, and then a cadential 6-4 where we go chord 4C, chord 1. Just zaps it up a bit further. Okay, now when we started this, I said that because of this 7th falling by step and 3rd rising by step, you have to follow your dominant 7th with a chord 1, a tonic chord, or with a chord 6, the submediant chord. Everything we've done in examples 1 to 8 has been focused on the tonic chord. So I just wanted to spend example 9 talking about what happens if we go to chord 6. So, well, the same things apply. So the first bar of example 9 is this. So you can hear instead of going to chord 1, I've gone to chord 6, the submediant chord. And here everything's behaving itself. The 7th is falling by step in the alto, the 3rd is rising by step in the soprano. Okay, what am I doing in the second bar? Little trick we've talked about. I'm starting with chord 5, I'm adding a passing note that makes it 5-7, and then I'm going on to chord 6. So this second bar sounds like this. Sounds all right, doesn't it? So we're reasonably happy with that. The third bar is just showing you something else we did before, but you know, instead of having the elaboration in the alto, we're putting it in the tenor. Okay, so there we are, and that's kind of, you know, gives us a slightly different resolution of it. Now, the reason I put that in there is just to alert you to a little potential problem. When you look at this, there's a perfect fifth between the tenor and the bass. When you look at this resolution, there's also a perfect fifth between the tenor and the bass. Now, it's a funny thing this, because does that mean that we have consecutive fifths between the tenor and the bass? Well, one argument is yes, we do, because this is just a sort of elaboration of the chord 5. So the essential movement is 5 to 6, and that's where we've got fifths. Another example, another school of thought would say, well, this is chord 5, this is a new chord, chord 5-7, and this is another new chord 6. And between here and there, we haven't got fifths. So some kind of gurus of harmony would say this means you've got consecutive fifths. Others would say that this means you haven't got consecutive fifths. So it's one of those funny things, isn't it? Another odd thing is, if the time signature were to be 2-2, then it would be even more dangerous, because this is the first beat, that's the second beat. So some would then say, well, you've definitely got consecutive fifths between this beat and that beat, and this is just something going on in between the beats. Because we're in 4-4, you can legitimately argue that's beat 1, that's a new beat. Beat 2, that's another new beat, beat 3. So in fact, you could justify your existence there. So it's one of those things to watch out for. If you're going to go 5/7 to 6, do we end up with something that could be deemed to be consecutive fifths? So a little health warning there, if you like. There's another thing you can do, which is quite a nice little harmonic elaboration, and it's another one of these sort of slightly delayed responses to the resolution. We've talked about how we might go 5 or 5/7 to 6. Well, one thing you can do is what I've done here, which is to go 5 and then say, well, let's have a diminished 7th onto 6. That's quite a colourful thing to do, isn't it? Or even start with the dominant 7th and then the diminished 7th onto 6. That's also equally good. So in other words, we're delaying the resolution to 6 by putting another chord in between that flows on quite nicely. And the diminished 7th is often a way of enriching a dominant 7th. So you have a dominant chord or you have a dominant 7th chord, and then you enrich it by doing that. Because if you have the dominant 7th chord, you're only actually moving one note up a semitone or a half step to get a diminished 7th, and that will be a diminished 7th in the key of B minor, A sharp, C sharp, E, G. But because the chord 6 in the key of D is a chord of B minor, it works really well. Now, the reason I've printed it as I have is to try and make another point. If you just use chord 5 instead of 5/7, you're likely to end up with something called false relations. This is an A natural in the alto there. That's an A sharp in the bass there. So what's a false relation? I've got A natural followed by A sharp. It does sound a bit strange, doesn't it? So when I've got the same note in a different octave, in a different part, but with a different accidental, that's a false relation. The bass isn't, because it's going A to A sharp at the same pitch effectively in the same part. It's just moving a semitone. But the alto A natural to A sharp in the bass is a false relation. So in this case, it would have been much better to have actually had a G in the alto there to start with a 5/7. And so when you move on to a diminished 7th, you're not dealing with false relations, and then on to the resolution. So you might be a bit surprised that there seems to be so much to think about when all we're doing is resolving one chord. And as I say, if you're just playing off a lead sheet and you're strumming or playing a dominant 7th followed by another chord, fine, go for it. If you're writing harmony, lots of mistakes get made with resolving dominant 7ths because people haven't had the opportunity to think about all of these issues. So if you want to be absolutely crystal clear about it, be entirely confident about it, what I've tried to do now is just to outline all the issues that you need to consider when resolving a dominant 7th chord. If you've enjoyed this video, then have a look at our website, www.mmcourses.co.uk, where you'll find details of our courses. Lots of online courses there on harmony, theory, oral work, analysis, orchestration, a lot of stuff, Bach chorales, how to do harmonization in the style of Bach. All sorts of things that might be of interest. So have a look around, see what you can find there. And while you're on the home page, have a click on Maestros to find out what that's all about. This is our wonderful global community of like-minded musicians, all delightful people, I can tell you. And we meet for a live stream once a month where there's a lot of teaching input from me for the first live stream, and then in the second live stream you've the opportunity to hand in recordings of your own performances, your own compositions, arrangements, harmony exercises, whatever, ask questions, and we do some real kind of one-to-one feedback stuff there, and we share that as a group, and you'll get all the mutual support from these wonderful people as well. So if that's of interest, have a look, see what you can find.